Guy, this is Guy. Are you there?
I am Guy. How are you doing?
Well, it's late and for me and it's early for you. That's been established. So can you tell me firstly where you are physically located in the world right now, Guy?
Yeah, I live in New York, an hour or so north of New York City, but right now I'm staying in the home of my partner's family in a suburb of Orlando, Florida. And I can't pronounce the name of the town, so I won't even try. So I'm down here in the south where it's a little warmer than it is now that the polar vortex is locked in to New York and vicinity. And I have to say, it's kind of nice.
Yeah,
I
yeah. I
agree with
imagine
Trump on
probably.
this one.
I
This
imagine
this whole warming thing is a great idea as long as you're on the receiving end.
if as long as you're in the right part of the drool, as I've heard it called.
Yep.
And so Orlando, Florida is marginally more comfortable than where it is in Idaho, which is now something like minus 50 wind chill factor.
And that's where I grew up, was in northern Idaho. And so I've
Oh,
experienced temperatures. Let's see, the Fahrenheit reading was minus 52. And so the Celsius reading on that must be in the neighborhood of minus 46 or 47, something like that.
right.
So it's fairly cool.
That's cold. Yeah, yeah. So I'm in Vegas, which is what the Brisbane people call it. Most people might call it Brisbane, but I think that Americans like to call it Brisbane. So I'm actually pretty open with all of that. And which is on the east coast of Australia, where we've been having a lot of heat. It's been pretty hot here. We haven't really copped the heat wave like the rest of Australia, but it's still been pretty hot. And I've been watering plants, which are just sort of not taking the heat particularly well, but we've lost a lot of bats and a lot of fish, and it's all chaotic under climate change. What I'd like to do, if you're prepared to just to hear me out for a moment, is just to share with you how I came to your work and how your work fits in with the stuff that I do. So I've been involved in, professionally involved in climate change since 2002, when I started working with an Australian Commonwealth government program called the Greenhouse Challenge. Um, and what I was doing then was I was doing carbon audits for businesses, and I actually focused, I was living up in North Queensland, so I actually focused on marine tourism operators. So I actually travelled out to the Great Barrier Reef numerous times, auditing the carbon emissions from these, basically mainly the diesel fuel consumption of the big fast cats, but also the emissions associated with running offices. Um, from 2002 until around about 2013, really I've got most of my information about climate change through the IPCC reports and through the Australian government's interpretation of those and their own scientists. And this is where you sort of come into the picture. It was in about 2013 that I first came across your work, where I first sort of your work was the first time I'd actually understood that there was another way of understanding what was happening vis-a-vis climate. And the one piece that I think that I remember was the interview you did with RT. And I remember sitting there watching that and thinking, this is really fascinating. I want to know more about that. So for the next couple of years, I actually sort of became a Duma myself. I sort of came on board that whole argument because it really seemed just a much more plausible explanation about what was going on than this slow crawl, climate change versus abrupt climate change. But then sometime around the end of 2015 to 2016, I started thinking about the spectrum a little bit differently, and in particular, this idea that we don't know what the future is. And given that the extinction of the human race is so grave, that I started spending a lot more time looking at, maybe there's a flaw in this argument, maybe there's a way out of this. And so where I come to now, so last year, 2018, September, I wrote a book called What Comes Next? Climate Change, the Future and You. And I kind of outlined a scenario. Well, I sort of said, I don't know what comes next, but here's one argument that says we're all cooked in a number of years. And here's another argument that says, maybe it's not so bad, maybe there's a way out of this. And so I'm deliberately going to focus my energies on understanding in depth both sides of the argument. And that's where you fit into it. And I think, so I want to say firstly, thank you, because you've helped me grow in my understanding of important matters. And so this is a personal thank you. But also, I think your work is valuable because what you do is you kind of create this counterpoint to an argument that says that's okay. You create a sense of urgency, and I think that is really valuable given how few people are actually engaged in this conversation. So that's where you fit into my life. No, thank you for that. Would you share with me very quickly, because a lot of people who are watching this probably are familiar, because we've got a relatively small audience in the world. Can you just give us a quick backstory about who is Guy McPherson and what's the central part of your message?
Sure. I'm a professor emeritus of conservation biology at the University of Arizona. I began studying anthropogenic climate change as part of my graduate work in the early 1980s. And it was only when I was editing a book in 2002, interestingly enough, which is a date you mentioned when you got professionally involved in climate change. It was in 2002 I was editing a book with a colleague about climate change, and specifically about precipitation as one component of climate change. And in putting together all these different chapters from a variety of sources, I concluded that as a result of our species losing habitat, we would go extinct. Homo sapiens would be extinct in the not too distant future. And this is 2002. I was still on campus at the university, and we don't have those kind of conversations on campus. There's no room for that sort of negative message. So I just locked it up in the crock pot of my brain and let it burble there, and got on with my life for several more years. And it wasn't for another half a dozen years that I mentioned it in public that, abrupt climate change is here, and what that means for human and non-human animals is the relatively near-term loss of habitat. And, I wasn't happy about that, but I felt it was my obligation to present the information to people. That's, after all, I was at a state-supported university. And so here we are a few years after 2002, and I'm pleasantly surprised that we're able to have this conversation, that we haven't gone extinct yet, obviously. In fact, we're still adding more than 200,000 people to the planet. Mm-hmm. And the urgency has grown as the evidence has accumulated. So now I present the evidence regarding abrupt climate change and where it leads from my perspective. And that doesn't make me the most popular person on the planet, but I'll continue to stick with it.
Yeah, well, there's something about I've heard that something about the shape of the parting has got a significant impact on the way that people are perceived in the in the media. Actually, you've partly answered my question. My first question was, because what I wanted to understand was, I'm really interested in like the tipping point, if you like. And so you're saying that you started researching climate change in the late 80s, or in the 80s, but in 2002 you're doing this detailed sort of drill down. And what I'm just really interested in, like the Malcolm Gladwell sort of idea that something happens and then something flips, and it's that little. I'm really interested in the straw that broke the camel's back. So back in 2002, when you had this realization, then when you went the aha moment. So what was there one specific thing that triggered you there?
There wasn't, and I've thought about this quite deeply. When did I reach a tipping point regarding the tipping points? Mm-hmm. And I can't point to a day or a moment when I was reading something. Rather, as with most things in my life, there was this steady accumulation. I was reading these chapters, reviewing these chapters, giving them to the co-editor of the book, discussing them back and forth with him, sending them back to the original author, getting the revised version back. And so all this took place over 6 or 8 months.
Right.
And it was a steady accumulation, this drip, 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 and the knowledge of soil-plant water relations, altered precipitation patterns, and what that means for our life support system that is planet Earth, most notably including plant life. And so it was really a steady drip over a span of several months. And then I just couldn't deny it anymore. I say that, but I did lock it away because it's not the kind of thing you want to come out about. You know, abrupt climate change is the new person of color, or the new LGBT. You know, it's different. It's different, and people don't really like different. It's sort of scary when you come out as something other or different from the so-called norm. So I did manage to lock it away for a few years. I was busy. I had, you know, courses to teach, and I was doing research, and graduate students I was advising, and so on. So I managed to keep myself busy enough that I didn't think much about this conclusion I had reached. But even the food you're cooking in a pressure cooker, if you leave it on the burner and you walk away too long, that thing's going to explode at some point. It's going to come out into the open. So, and ultimately that's what happened. I tried to ignore it for a long time, and finally I couldn't. I felt it was my obligation as a professional who was studying relevant topics to come forward with the information.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that. Let me just,
and in many ways I wish I hadn't, because it has cost me a lot in my life to come forward with the evidence. And so had I to do it over again, and of course we don't get a rerun, but I'm not sure I would do it. I suspect I would just keep it locked away and live in my suburban house in Tucson, Arizona, and keep drawing the 6-figure paychecks and not rock the proverbial boat.
Were there other people? Were there other people that drawn that conclusion that you'd come to, or do you think that were you the first person that you'd known who'd come to that conclusion?
Yeah, I was certainly the first person that I knew about. Now, other people were talking about human extinction in the relatively short term, but by relatively short term, they meant 100 years from now.
Right. Okay.
You know, so the leading authority on abrupt climate change at the time was a guy named Richard Alley. And that's what he was talking about in terms of abrupt climate change, was a century out, not decades, not years, but really what we would consider over the span of a human lifetime. Quite a long time from now. That's something for the grandchildren to worry about. That's not for us, that sort of thing.
And so he was basically proposing the same sort of methodology, if you like, or the same sort of outcome, but just projecting it being further into the future.
Right. Taking the paleo-ecological perspective or the geological perspective of this playing out over time spans consistent with epochs, right, and eras, not over human lifetimes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that. And the term, excuse me, going like that, so I'm just blind as a bat, but the term near-term human extinction, was that your term, or where did that come from?
I think it was, but and I'm constantly told that it was, generally not favorably. I think I came up with it. I can't point to anybody else who said it. I didn't mean to. It just seemed to make sense to me. Yeah.
Okay. Because I mean, the fundamental difference between your position and these other people was the
right. Absolutely. It's not something that I sat in a room with a bunch of marketing guys and, you know, decided this is my brand.
If you'd actually had a bunch of marketing guys that were trying to market you, you should fire them.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, you've got a good following, but you know, you want to get out to the mass appeal, mate. You need to get this name. What are we going to call it? We're going to make this thing popular. Okay. Right. That's right. Okay. So I've actually done question number 3. We're chopping through this really quick. Oh, here's the other thing. So this has been on your mind for a long time. I mean, really, you're saying since 2002. So you've been thinking about this gloomy stuff for as long as I've been thinking about climate change. I've created these new terms, right? So there's an idea of a Duma, which is somebody who says we're all doomed, it's going to happen soon. And I'm thinking, well, I'm kind of a doomer, but I'm kind of like, you know, I'm hedging my bets a little bit here.
Right.
So I call myself a gloomer, right? So a gloomer is somebody who's kind of like on the edge of being a doomer, but is still leaving the door open for some, I don't know, something, right? In one of your recent interviews, I think somebody asked you a question, and I don't mean to misquote you, so something like, maybe if there is 20 or 30 miracles happen, then it won't happen. Is that
right?
So
that's about right.
I spend a lot of time dreaming up miracles.
Yeah, and I'm completely open to that, by the way. I'm completely
Yeah.
open to new evidence that
Yeah.
illustrates good news. But
Yeah.
I've been studying environmental issues since my first days on a college campus in 1978.
Yeah.
And as nearly as I can tell, nothing has gotten significantly better in that whole time. We're
Well,
recycling more.
I will agree completely. I mean, in my 16 years of being involved, I mean, I started my environmental inquiry in 1992, working in the oil industry, watching, watching the plastic bags drift past a ship off the coast of Taiwan, which was really my first ecophany, as I call it, which is like an ecological epiphany, that first moment at which I went, wow, something's going on. And then participating in that industry, and actually we ran an oil ship aground on a coral reef and dragged all of our air guns and streamer cable. I participated in it. I was a part of it, and nobody ever got in trouble. So seeing it happen was one thing, but knowing that that was just the way it was. So I did an environmental science degree and then studied an honours, and wrote a paper on the environmental management of the offshore oil industry, oil exploration industry in Southeast Asia, and concluded through my paper that nothing was going to change. And so pretty much ever since then, I've just seen the degradation of the planet. And if you just look at, for example, the Paris Agreement, the Paris Agreement signed in December 2015, as inadequate as it was, it still required us to reduce carbon. And yet here we are, nearly 3 years later, and it's the highest carbon's ever been. So, and so this is, if there was some difference between your position and my position, it narrows every day I read the news that there hasn't been some fundamental paradigmatic shift in the way that the world leaders regard climate change, so.
Right. Well, there's no getting elected to any political position on the basis of industrial civilization is a bad idea. Industrial civilization has these adverse outcomes. Nobody's going to run on that campaign.
Well, they might run.
We can't have this conversation. You're telling me I can't use my electric razor. You're telling me I can't keep the lights on. I mean, there's so many things that go along with that.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the thing. So you've been involved in this, thinking these things since 2002. So are you prepping? How are you prepping for it? Because if it's imminent for you, how are you just going to go about your business as if nothing was happening and just take it on the chin, or have you got some secret squirrel plan? Have you got a bunker underneath your Airstream?
when I managed to lock away this information in the crackpot in the back of my brain, I did prep. I established in southern rural New Mexico. I went full scale prepper, with all the food and the 2 solar pumps and a hand pump and photovoltaic solar power and the whole 9 yards, right? More than 5 tons of food stored away in a cargo container, buried underground.
Can you tell me the coordinates for that? Just on the side here.
What's that?
Is it still there?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I sold it.
Right. Okay.
Going that route, which I began to do in 2007. So this is after I knew, but I managed to lock it away. And so I began prepping for the future that, as it turns out, I suspect now will never come. I was prepping for linear gradual climate change, the Al Gore style climate change, which the IPCC version with which we're mostly familiar.
Yeah.
And that caused the complete destruction of every relationship in my life. So I stopped doing that, moved to Belize in Central America, which is the worst possible place if you actually, quote, believe in climate change, because it warms up at the equator first and then toward the poles. And then my partner had family issues that had me moving with her to New York State. And so that's where I live now just since October, so not for very long. And so really the first time I've lived for a significant amount of time on the East Coast. I did a year in Washington, D.C. when I was helping establish the Smith Fellows postdoctoral program. And my postdoc was in Athens, Georgia, so those were East Coast. But I knew that each of those was a temporary move that was going to be short in duration. And I suspect this one will be short in duration, but for another reason.
Right. Okay. Okay,
and,
good.
and that's because we don't have long, not because I'm not interested in living where I live.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. So, okay, here's a hypothetical. So if you're in 2002, you're reading this material and having a sense of this, having slipped over the tipping point, right, which is the runaway greenhouse, basically, the runaway greenhouse effect. How far back would you have to go, do you think, before that we could have actually had a reasonable chance of changing the way that industrial civilization operated?
Yeah.
When was the last, when was the very edge? Because you were saying you came into this halfway down the tipping point, if you like, or halfway down the slope almost. Where was the point where it wasn't a slope, it was actually flat, do you think?
Well, and this is, I suspect it was in the 1940s or 1950s, maybe even 1939, when the first nuclear power was harnessed.
Right.
And so maybe it's the combination of nuclear power, of ionizing radiation, to result from the catastrophic meltdown of the world's now more than 400 nuclear power plants. If that's considered a tipping point that goes along with or follows on to the collapse of civilization as a result of abrupt climate change, then we have to go back to the 1930s.
Yeah, sure.
And regardless, that I uncovered it in 2002 or reached this realization in 2002 suggests that it was at least a generation or two before that that we could have stopped the thing. And part of this is rooted in global dimming. And there's a paper out within the last week or so indicating that we've massively underestimated global dimming. And so at what point do we have to go back to undo global dimming, which is the cooling effect produced by particulates, mostly aerosols, from burning coal? Well, we've been burning coal for a long time.
Yeah.
Easily 250 years.
Yeah.
So I don't know when the actual tipping point when we could have turned things around was, but I suspect you and I weren't born yet.
Yeah, that's a really interesting answer to that question, because I was sort of pondering what the answer might be the other day, and I was thinking of I listened to a lot of work by Johan Rockstrom from the Stockholm Resilience Center, and in that model, or one of the things that is commonly said is that there was something happened in the world around about the 1990s. So if the Anthropocene epoch, which is where the humans started to have the overwhelming sort of influence on the planet, started around the sort of end of the early 50s, really. If that's an argument, but it wasn't really until 40 years later that we started breaking things, and that's when we started to see these shifts in the environment. So I'd actually anticipated that your answer might have been something a decade or two before that. But I hear what you say as well. I mean, if the part of the elimination, because we're not just talking about climate change, we're just talking about the elimination of the humans off this planet is not just about the place getting hot; it's about it getting radiated.
Right.
You can actually live underground if it's hot, but you can't live underground if you've got radioactive rain coming out of the sky.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. I think immediately post World War II was huge from a societal perspective. That's when in the United States we began to develop the interstate highway system and suburbia and all of the lifestyle changes that come with that, which then spread out to the rest of the world. So there's little doubt that from a societal perspective, immediately post World War II was huge.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Now back onto the radiation issue. A year or so ago, I get these questions into my mind, and they go on these sort of like benders they go on for days sometimes, trying to understand certain technical details. And so I had this question about Fukushima, and so I went on this sort of bender into Fukushima, because Fukushima is, well, one thing is actually really complicated because it's about radioactivity, and radioactivity has got its whole set of technical complexities you don't find in normal physics. Also, Fukushima generates a vast amount of scientific and public chatter, as well as not only like from the government institutions in Japan. There's reports that I've sort of looked at from them, which then you've got to apply the political aspects of the fact that the system is geared towards talking down the scale of the problem. Can we talk about Fukushima for a moment? Are you comfortable to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And as an indication of how that has become a political endeavor, we're having the Olympic Games there, and that was announced right after, they got the bid right after the meltdown. Come on. If that isn't politics, that's as political as the Nobel Peace Prize.
That should have an award for a bad idea award. So
ultimately, we all win the Darwin Award.
So let me explain my understanding of the disaster, and then I'll get to the point of where I start to get fuzzy and require somebody with maybe some more information. So they got this nuclear power station called Fukushima Daiichi, which actually had 6 nuclear reactors on it, 2 of which were abandoned, 4 of which were operating. There was a big earthquake. The underwater earthquake, knocked out the mains power, and you need a lot of energy to run the cooling pumps on nuclear power stations. And then the diesel generators kicked in, which is fine. It was no problems there. Normal, you expect that. And then the tsunami knocked out the diesel generators, and then the batteries kicked in. They ran for a number of hours, and then the batteries ran dry. The pumps failed, and then shortly, within hours, or I don't know how many hours, but like less than a day or something, 1, 2, 3 of those plants basically overheated, produced an excess of hydrogen. The hydrogen basically got some oxygen in it, caught fire, and blew the lid off the 3 reactors. And that particular type of reactor, from what I was reading, was actually a scaled up version of a reactor that was designed for nuclear submarines. And so something strange about that design was they had the cooling towers, or the cooling ponds, above the reactor core, where normally they'd be out off to the side. And so when the reactor blew up, it actually blew up underneath the swimming pool full of all of the previously pooled fuel rods, which I think are in the order of 10 times more in volume than the amount of rods that are actually in the core. So if you've got, I think, in the order of 150 tons of uranium and plutonium in the core, which is blown up, you've actually got 1,500 tons of plutonium, uranium in the swimming pool above. And for 2 of the 3 buildings that blew up, there was no structural integrity loss to the swimming pool, to the cooling pool. But in one of the buildings, there was actually structural issues off the pool. And the concern was that if that water drains out, that because these rods are basically zirconian rods, that zirconian, if I get my science right, that if you expose those rods to the air, they're just going to automatically start burning. And then you can have effectively 1,500 tons of uranium and plutonium start burning uncontrollably. And there's nothing really you can do to put it out because of the intense heat that will be created, apart from pour seawater onto it, which is going to flush back out into the ocean. Have I got that right?
That's my understanding of it, yes. Although you make it sound not much more pleasant than I think it is, with your nice calm tone and everything. You're describing a process that could lead to the extinction of much of life on Earth, and you do it in such a calm voice that I want to go to sleep.
Well, I'm talking to a master. I learned everything from you. I'm channeling Guy channels Guy here. But that's the point, is that if that cooling pond burns, that alone is going to put so much radiation into the atmosphere that it's just going to be enough, because you need the most microscopic particles, the most microscopic quantities of this material for it to actually interfere and create cancers. And because everything moves on the planet, the atmosphere moves and the ocean moves.
Right. And so we're breathing that stuff in today, and there are, as I understand it, back a few years, there were 99 of those GE Mark III, Mark IV, whatever sort of power plant it is. There's 99 of those in the United States alone. So there's a bunch more of this to come, where you put the cooling ponds 4 or 5 stories above ground in a swimming pool. And almost all of those are in places that are geologically unstable.
Yeah. And like there was a in Ukraine, which of course had some sort of a civil war running. There was a period there in the last couple of years where there was rebels. I think the nuclear power station sort of changed hands. I don't know if the administration of the power station changed hands, but the political control of the territory went backwards and forwards between rebels and the government forces. And like you're saying, if you got in those sorts of places, I mean, I follow a lot of geopolitics, and I particularly follow this, like ISIS, and I think these guys pop up everywhere,
Right.
and understanding that religious conviction of theirs. I've got this paper here, Guy. I'm just going to bring it up here. I'm going to share this with you. This is called, I don't know if you can see that. It's called The Devoted Actor. Mm-hmm. And this is a science sociologist, a guy called Atran, who's trying to understand what it is that allows ISIS to be such potent fighters. These guys come from all over the world. They're going to lose their lives. They're going to get blown up, for the caliphate. And the reason I started reading this was because there was this environmental group. I'm not going to name them, but just not far from where I am, and there was a borrow pit, which is basically a hole dug in the ground to get the soil to build up the ground to build the real estate, which over 30 years turned into this really beautiful little ecosystem with like birds flying in, really biodiverse. And the people used to go and walk their dogs there in the morning. It was this place of serenity and peace in what was otherwise quite a large, sprawling suburb. And then when the local turf club decided they want to fill it in, because it was on the turf club property, turf club being a horse racing club, wanted to fill it in to create an overflow parking, right? So this is to have extra car parks when they get really busy. They just wanted to turf it. The local environmental group put up a fight, but they didn't put up a fight strong enough to actually stop the turf club and the local council filling in the goddamn hole. And so I'm thinking, well, so what is it in the human psyche that these guys can go and run around with suicide bombs strapped to their vest, jump out of taxis in Western cities and massacre people knowing that they're going to get killed? Where does that conviction come from? And how do we inculcate that conviction into environmentalists? Because if this thing falls over and there's any chance that it's going to be fixed, it's going to require some people like that with that sort of passion. And so that's what I'm trying to do, is to try and get my head around that. And this paper actually just sort of outlines the psychology. And at the heart of this psychology is this fact that if you want to get the best out of people when it comes to making personal sacrifice, you need to appeal to their spirituality, not their rationality. That's the heart. And that's exactly what ISIS does.
Well, and what you're talking about here is the stuff that really matters, and that academic institutions, probably all institutions, are poorly designed to tackle. Yeah. You're talking about the intersection between societal issues, natural sciences. We're talking about spirituality. You don't raise these issues on college campuses. The people who are in this so-called science departments are not going to interact, unfortunately, with the people who are in the religious studies department, who are in the social sciences department, who are in, you can barely get a geographer and a geoscientist to have a conversation about coffee in the same room together, much less bring together all of these elements that you're talking about. And that's absolutely pivotal. If we're going to make any significant change, and we've known this since at least the 1960s during the American Cultural Revolution, we're going to have this intersection between environmental protection and social justice. And those come from two very different places.
Yeah.
Your example is just one more that Joni Mitchell was singing about in the 1960s. Pave paradise, put up a parking lot.
Yeah.
That's just what we do, and we can't seem to help ourselves. And I think a large part of it lies, the blame lies at the feet of the institutions, including academic institutions, who do not provide enough incentive for appropriate people to interact with each other.
Yeah.
So everybody's stuck in their own silo and unwilling to have a conversation about anything that matters with somebody from across campus or even across the hall.
Yeah. I've just recently, I've nearly completed, I've got a couple of units to go, a Master of Business at a prestigious university in Australia. And in about 2.5 years of full-time study, Master of Business, not an MBA, a Master of Business, just to make that distinction. Not once did anybody mention the concept of a carbon-constrained economy. Not once did anybody mention the idea that it's impossible to grow infinitely on a finite planet. And so this is a prestigious university in Australia, has utterly failed to actually create any context to the graduates. And so this institution is pumping out thousands a year of graduates who are basically going out and behaving like ecological psychopaths, which is effectively the behavioral pattern, except that they don't know they're doing it, right? They're engaging in the growth economy, trying to maximize shareholder value, trying to skew that distribution of wealth away from the people that got the shares from all the other people, and effectively regarding everything and everyone who is not a shareholder of the corporation as a piece of collateral for their machinery. And that's what the machine is teaching them. I'm going to complete the degree, but I got to a point I'm like, what the fuck am I doing here? You know?
Well, you bring up a good point. In the United States, at least, I don't know if this is the case in Australia, but in the United States, corporations are by statute required to maximize shareholder value. They're required by law, in other words, to destroy the planet.
Yeah. And you know what? And there are some people, and I'm thinking of Ray Anderson with the famous story about interface carpets, who was under exactly the same pressure, who said, I'm going to maximize profits and fix this thing, right? So this is something I come to. I was at this sustainability and business conference on the Gold Coast a few weeks ago. I don't know if I really want to go to this. And I actually came away from that going, and this is actually, it's funny, you know, if I think of all of the people that I can talk to and I say the word sustainability and they broadly know what I'm talking about, if I go to a sustainability and business conference, I guarantee you nobody will listen to me talk about abrupt climate change. But if I go and talk to the average person on the street who is ignorant of the subject matter, then they can come into the conversation and they'll go, that's really interesting, thanks for that. But you go, and so I was telling you about, I don't know if I told you in the interview or previously, but you got the Dumas, right, who think, well, fuck, there's nothing we can do about it. You got the Gloomers, like me, who are a bit gloomy about what's happening, but we're looking for a way out. But then you got the Bloomers, right? And the Bloomers are like,
yeah, of course.
Now, they know climate change.
We have these. We have these.
Yeah, exactly.
We can do anything.
We can do anything, exactly. So there was this guy. I mean, I've written this stuff in my book, right? Shameless self-promotion, but I've written this. I wrote about this. I wrote about the Gloomers, Doomers, and Bloomers and the deniers. I haven't got a UMA name for a denier, so you're smart. You can come up with one. I need to keep the rhythm going there. But anyway, this guy was bragging about his sustainability program. And I won't name names, but it was a convention center that they ran. And convention centers are big. I'm a carbon auditor. You give me a convention center, you know, I'll do a carbon audit before I've even looked at the power bill. I mean, this thing's in the thousands of tons, you know. Big spaces, big air conditioning plants, lots of lighting, running 24 hours a day. And anyway, this guy said, we've got this energy efficiency program, reducing carbon. And he said, we've reduced the equivalent amount of carbon as, I think, 100 Australian homes over the decade. And I'm like, I quickly just did the sums. I'm like, that's fucking nothing. Like, he's cut his carbon footprint by 3 or 4%, or 5 tops. Okay. And you know what? He won a platinum fucking award for that. And you know what else? They put the platinum award documentation in all of their fucking marketing collateral. And I'm like, this is the best that we've got for sustainability in business. This guy is actually up on stage. He didn't shoot himself in the fucking head or commit harakiri out of shame having told that story. And so, you know, so like every time I go and see that, I'm thinking, fuck, that Guy McPherson, you know, he's onto something. That Duma, you know, it's like sort of Glummer, Duma.
Well, that's right. You look at the sacrifices people are willing to make, and it does not match up at all with the nature of the problem that they're talking about. And it hasn't forever.
Yeah.
You know, there's this paper that just came out, New York Times, Washington Post, I don't remember where it was, very big time corporate newspaper, right, indicating that that a significant proportion of Americans are now concerned about climate change, but almost nobody is willing to spend $10 a month to fix it.
Yeah, yeah, $10 a month. Yeah.
We're talking about the loss of 200 species a day on the planet, and people won't spend $10 a month.
Yeah. My first degree was environmental science, but I did honors in environmental economics and environmental policy. And in environmental economics, we had some tools where we were looking at measuring. I'm just trying to think of the name of it, but there was an economic tool for measuring to try and put a value on nature. And so one of the things we did was we went and did this survey in a national park to try and put an economic value to this national park, which had lots of trees and like rainforests and stuff in it. And what we did is we interviewed people and we asked them how much money they'd spent to drive there. So it's basically a travel cost analysis.
Right.
And if you get that sort of those sorts of numbers, then what you can do is you can say, okay, well, we know that the people of Brisbane are prepared to spend $25 in fuel to go and see this place. And if you multiply that out, then you can actually then put a dollar figure on it. But what you're just saying there is that there's this cognitive dissonance, and this is part of this is like I talk to people a lot about all this climate change stuff and about the abrupt climate change and the seriousness of it, and I know that they don't believe me, right? And so and I know that you reach a lot of people, and I'm convinced that most people don't believe you, because when I tell people about what you said, they don't believe me telling you about it, and I'm more convincing in the way that I tell the story, as you've demonstrated with Fukushima, than you are, because I don't parting.
You part your hair on the right side, so people are going to pay attention.
I cut my hair short, so I don't have to worry about that. So apart from anything else, most people just don't believe it, right?
Well, absolutely.
Which makes perfect sense.
And at some level, you have to exhibit cognitive dissonance, even if you do believe it.
You have to.
Because it can be so overwhelming for most people emotionally to live with the fact that they're actually going to die. I saw this great meme on social media the other day. Somebody asked a patient, a terminal patient, what it's like to live knowing you're going to die. And the cancer patient responds, what's it like pretending that you're not going to die?
Yeah.
And that's what we mostly do. We pretend that we're not going to die, that we don't have a terminal diagnosis that was, brought to us at birth.
Yeah, yeah.
We just act, as you indicated earlier, the infinite growth paradigm, the insanity of that at a societal level trickles down to each of us as individuals. And so at some level, we have to act as if we're going to have more days ahead of us. We have to plan for the future. Mm-hmm. And so that robs us of the here and now. And one of the things my message is hopefully doing for some people is not robbing them of the here and now, reminding them that the here and the now is what we have.
That's all we got, yeah. So just onto my my little list of questions here, Guy. Thanks for that. That's good stuff. Yeah, okay, so hypothetically, here's just an idea I want to throw out there. I haven't pitched this to anybody that knows what I talk about, so you're going to be the first here. But about this global dimming thing, so I've been spending a bit of time reading about the aerosol masking effect, and it's funny when I tell people about climate change and how serious it is and how we've got to turn off the generators and how it's going to be really difficult to transition in time, assuming it was time. And then I say, oh, by the way, and if we do that, it's going to actually hit the planet up beyond the 2 degrees. And then they go, and I think that's the point where they go, what the fuck are you joking? Like it's bad enough, right, without the aerosol masking effect.
Right.
But here's my idea, because I've spent I got into reading about and drilling down into upwelling pumps about a year ago. So I spent a bit of time. I was Brian von Herzen's work with marine permaculture, where if you can bring the water from depth in the ocean, you bring nutrients to the surface, which then kicks off an algae bloom, a plankton bloom. And so what I was thinking was, if hypothetically, if you can actually do that at scale, one of the things that the plankton do is they create aerosol. And so conceivably, this is just in my, optimistic moments, if you could actually start bringing these algae blooms up on scale, I'm talking about thousands and thousands of square kilometers of ocean being brought into life, and most of the ocean is actually relatively lifeless because it's nutrient poor, then you could conceivably, I don't know, somehow kind of like mask the loss of the aerosol masking effect. So that's like the big picture sort of thing. But the aerosol masking effect, from what I understand as well, is actually kind of partly it's regional. So, for example, if China turned off its generators, China would get the heat. So how the hell are we going to grow all that plankton in fucking central China? So there's one problem we got to address in my theorem. Is there any
I've read about people flooding the deserts with ocean water, so maybe we can turn all the interior deserts into ocean, then we can grow plankton there.
Well, there's been a few. The Lake Eyre in Australia is actually below sea level, I believe. So all we've got to do is just dig a couple of little trenches, and
there are these big ideas which might represent solutions, such as the one you just pointed out. They're few and far between. And I don't see any action being taken on them. We got this David Keith Gates Foundation nonsense going on, spraying the skies in the southwestern part of the United States without anybody's permission, by the way. And we actually are, there's considerable information about solar radiation management, and none of it points to a good outcome. All of it indicates that it's immoral because it shifts precipitation zones. And so we're talking about starving people in one place so that we can feed people in another place. But I suppose that's been the point of empire all along. So maybe I shouldn't get too worried about that.
Yeah, well, business.
I just don't, I would like to see somebody bring together all the relevant people proposing these reasonable solutions, not the crazy stuff. I don't know who gets to decide. And have a conglomeration of people have a conversation over the course of a few days or a week to see what's actually rational and can be implemented. And it's not about money. I hear all the time that money comes into play here, but it really doesn't, because the United States federal government is in debt so deep that it could never possibly be repaid. And so they just print more money, but they don't even print the money. They just put digits on a computer screen. Yeah. It's all invented. It's fake. The whole monetary system at this point is fake. So don't tell me it's about money. Just make it happen.
Yeah, and look, that's like I say, when my Glummer needle starts to shift towards Duma, it's like all of these incredible wasted opportunities. So I'm looking at Davos. For me, I mean, I spend over the years that I've been researching this, trying to understand why we're doing these things. It occurs to me that the actual heart of the climate change problem is power. It's simply about the distribution of who makes the decisions on the planet. And the biggest decisions are made by psychopaths, basically, sociopaths, people who have got no, or either they're ignorant and they don't understand, or they just don't care, or they don't get it, or I don't know. But so with something like Davos comes along, and you see, here's they had 1,500 private jets flying into this meeting. That's a lot of private jets. That's I don't care about the carbon footprint per se, but that's a lot of powerful people getting together. And I read the report. So they canvass all of the people that are coming to Davos, and they write this annual report, which is a business risk analysis. And this year was more so than the other years, but in previous years, and particularly this year, climate change and extreme weather and the absence of government commitment to climate change policies is the highest risk in the view of this group. And so I'm thinking, when I'm reading that report before the get together with all these powerful people, and I'm thinking, what an amazing opportunity. And they've got Greta there, who's getting in there, a 15-year-old girl telling these adults off, which is fantastic. But what comes out of Davos? There's nothing comes out of Davos. It's like it's another wasted opportunity. And as you're saying, it's like, and this is where I start to feel the inevitability of this imminent collapse, is the total absence of action. It's just, I mean, there's plenty of people on the street, but the people don't make the decisions in this system. The democratic system don't function the way they're supposed to. They don't represent the interests of the public.
Right. I would argue that the same thing came out of Davos that went into Davos, 1,500 private jets.
Exactly. They flew in, they flew out. So, business as usual.
Right.
But here's the crazy thing is that, and that's actually one of the other questions I wanted to ask you, and this one you'll have some clarity, there's no bunker big enough to hide from a rerun of the Permian extinction.
Right.
Where the fuck are they going to go? And like you're saying, if the power stations fall down, then what are you going to stop breathing air? It's going to be contaminated with nuclear radiation.
And of course, the people who have a lot of money on this planet have a lot of money because they're tapped into information. So I would argue that very, very many of them know what you and I know. They know about tipping points. They know that the permafrost is going away. They know that the methane is spewing out of the Arctic Ocean. They know that the Amazon rainforest is no longer a carbon sink, and so on. They know all of these things. And so the response is not to try to fix what's happening because it's unfixable. It's to party on for another day. It's to fly their private jet into Davos and back out of Davos. It's to live large and knowing that there's no bunker that's going to save them.
Right.
But also knowing that they have their 25 or 2,500 acres, so they'll get to die in relative peace compared to the rest of us.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that is actually a hypothesis that makes sense. Is that they have looked at the data, and they've drawn the conclusion that there's no way out, and so why change? Rather than looking at the data and saying we're in for a bit of shit here, let's build a big bunker.
Right. If it's damned if you do and damned if you don't, they're going to party on. They're going to do as they've done.
So how do we get into one of these bunkers? It's like
how, and the question is why, really. And I had that sort of setup in New Mexico, and then the full effect of the aerosol masking effect became known, and that's when I started to transition away from spending 16 to 18 hours a day milking goats and taking care of chickens and planting gardens and growing food and all that. Because if you're damned if you do and damned if you don't, then why would I do something I'm not very good at?
Yeah.
When I could be doing something that I think is useful and that I am relatively good at, which is annoying the crap out of people. Yeah.
Yeah. So hypothetically, if there was a way of slowing this thing down, which conceivably there would be, if you could hypothetically pull a trillion tons of carbon out of the atmosphere in 30 years, that would make a dent in it. It wouldn't change the fact that we built up all the heat in the ocean. Wouldn't change the fact that we did the thermodynamic shift in the Arctic. But so in a way, the idea of slowing it down is actually the scale of what you'd need to do to even slow it down, let alone stop it and reverse it, is so grand. But if hypothetically, if there was some way of slowing it down, what would you see as what approach would be the best option? I mean, hypothetically, if you were all powerful and said, I want to slow this thing down, what would you wave your wand to do?
For a few years, I believed that slowing or stopping industrial activity was the way to go. And so I promoted the idea of dismantling industrial civilization. And then I learned about the aerosol masking effect, the full impact of the aerosol masking effect. And I didn't know about it. I thought I did. This goes back to 2013. And now we know even more as a result of the paper that came out within the last week or two. And I realized it truly is a paradox. It's damned if you do and damned if you don't. I have no idea how to slow what we're doing because reducing carbon emissions doesn't do it. And that's supposed to be the problem. Sequestering carbon, if we could do that at scale, would be great, especially if we could do it outside of the heat engine that is industrial civilization. So if there was anything resembling a way out, I'd be talking about it every day, but I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
If there's any way to slow this sucker down, I would be doing it. I would be talking about it, but I don't see it.
Yeah. Okay. I understand. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
You know, I have nothing to lose. Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose, as Chris Christopherson wrote.
Yeah. Look,
And
you know, I've actually been comfortable with the idea of the extinction of the human race since I was about 13. My father worked with nuclear bombers. He worked in 57 Squadron, Royal Air Force. He worked with the Victors, and they had these planes, half a dozen of these planes parked around the UK on permanent standby with the engines running at the end of the runway with a bomb on board, a 400 kiloton thermonuclear weapon, ready to go at a moment's notice. And my father was airframes maintenance on these planes. And so at age like probably 13, I was conversant with nuclear annihilation and nuclear winter and that whole, you know, strategic posture and mutually assured destruction. I mean, this stuff was, I've been doing this stuff for a long time. And I think around age 13, I don't know if you've ever heard of this book. He gave me a copy of a book called Earth Abides.
oh yeah,
Yeah. So I read that.
George Stewart.
Yeah. Who?
George Stewart,
George
right?
Stewart. Okay. That's
The
it.
author.
Yeah. And I'm just trying to think of the name of the protagonist. So the story of Earth Abides was that this young guy went into the mountains around Los Angeles or somewhere, and on a research project, he got bitten by a snake, and so he was like sick for weeks. And when he finally got back to civilization, he'd been away for Isherwood Williams. That was the name of the protagonist in the story. And so when Isherwood Williams came back to civilization, everyone was dead because of a pandemic had come through, and there was just a handful of people who he'd come to meet over the following years, and he reestablished society, or a society, from that handful of people. And it's a beautiful book. So I read that when I was about 13, on top of thinking about thermonuclear weapons.
Right. I think that book was published in 1949, Earth Abides, and it was one in a series of books by George W. Stewart. He was a faculty member at Berkeley, and so that was actually set in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Okay.
And he, through this series of books he wrote, he changed the way books are written and the way movies are made.
Right.
In his books, the central character was not the protagonist that you just mentioned.
Right.
It was the event. It was the catastrophe.
Right.
And so shortly after that, we had all these movies come out, like the Titanic and the Poseidon Adventure and all these things, all these movies that are really about these events.
Yes.
That are taken, and the humans are just bit players in the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he wrote an amazing series of books, one of them called Wildfire, but basically they all had as the central character the disaster, whatever the disaster was.
Yeah.
And Earth Abides is a absolutely phenomenal book that I would recommend to anybody.
Yeah. So I'm not sure how we got on to that, but so here's just one more question. This has been really great, and I'd like to talk to you again down the track, but if I can ask you just one more question and then we close, if that's all right. If we're going to put a title to this, because I've got like this little title slide in my intro, what are we going to title this? And two or three words? How do we title this conversation? If you don't tell me something, I'm going to write something, so it's going to happen anyway. This is your last chance, mate. So.
I'm going to have to leave this one in your hands.
It's late and it's early, so it's something about lack of sleep and lack of.
Well, how about the quest for solutions?
Quest for solutions.
Because that's what we're talking about here. We're probing around. We're poking sticks. We're trying to come up with some solutions. And where does that take us? What does that mean? What does that cause to come up in each of us? This quest for solutions that may or may not be successful. You know, at some level, we as a society, we as a species are facing what individuals face when they're in hospice. How do they face that? And of course, for every human being, there's a different response to the terminal diagnosis. And so at the level of society, we're talking 7.7 billion people now. There's going to be a different response. There's going to be 7.7 billion responses to the terminal diagnosis. And we're poking around. We're trying to find some solutions. We're trying to get people interested. We're trying to promote a conversation. And where does that go? We don't know.
Well, you know, and we do it knowing that the outcome might be futile, and we do it because it's what we do. You know, tell me, did I hear this from you, or did I get this from someone else? Because I mentioned it in an interview I did the other day. It's this. Imagine the scene. There's like a firing squad. You've got the 8 guys there with the rifles pointed and the whatever the captain's name is, and they bring this guy out, and he's like dancing. It's like, did you tell this story? Did I get it from you?
That's not me, but it sounds great. In fact,
Yeah,
the title of my next book.
So they're they're tying him to the post, and he's like, and the captain is like, what the? He said, what are you doing? Will you stop doing that? He said, what are you going to do? You're going to shoot me? He said, why are you doing that? Because it's what I do, right? This is what I do. And this is what I do. And I'll keep doing it until the exit wound blows my brains out of the back of my head.
Right.
You know?
The title of my next book, which should be out within the next month or two, is Only Love Remains: Dancing at the Edge of Extinction.
There we go.
That's what we get to do. We actually get to dance. We have these lives of enormous privilege that allow us to pursue things like this conversation, and also that allow us to dance, knowing that we have a terminal diagnosis. Yeah.
Well, on that cheery note, guys. So my draft title was Guy v. Guy. But I don't actually see this as a versus. It's more of a sort of an overlap, like a what do they call it? A Venn diagram, right?
Right. So there's a guy who occasionally drives me around when I'm in New York State.
Right.
So he first wrote to me. He sends me an email message, and he says, "I've known about your work. If ever you're flying into New York, I live nearby, and I'll give you a ride, whatever." And I said, "Okay, tomorrow. I'll be flying. I'll be arriving at 7 p.m." And his name is Guy too, and there aren't that many of us. Yeah. So his tagline when he sends me an email message is always TOG. He signs it TOG, otherwise known as the other guy.
So
it turns out we're everywhere. There's guys everywhere.
There is not a lot of us, and that's probably a good thing, because we kind of we like that. We like to have that sort of, you know, especially we don't want to be a freaking John or, you know.
Right.
But yeah, Tog, I like that. It's sort of like, it reminds me of it's like a caveman's name, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Named Tog.
He would appreciate that.
Okay, so I'll be the other guy, you be the other guy. The other guy in New York will be the other guy. We'll all be the other guy.
Yep.
Not that guy, the other guy.
We were all Tog here.
We're all Tog here. Maybe there's a third title for this show. In fact, that's a better title. I'm thinking like a marketer now. Is that capitalized or just lowercase?
No, he does it all lowercase.
Lowercase, okay. Humility. You don't get a lot
right, there you go.
You get a lot of humilities from guys, so it's a good place to start. Okay, thank you, my friend.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay.